President Trump's recent visit to China has surprised many of us, especially given the years of tariffs and economic wars and technological rivalry.
The US, despite its aggressive posture towards different countries, it is a declining imperial power.
There is no such thing as a multipolar world order. That's just stupidity. So what's your take on this?
History is moving towards Beijing, and Trump will be, and it was clear that he will not be able to reverse the flow of history.
China once positioned itself as an ideological alternative to Western capitalism, but today we see that it possesses global corporations, expanding financial influence.
The stakes are too high. I said the US economy cannot survive without China.
Does it still represent a fundamentally different model of global power? How do you justify this?
It shows that America is unable to impose its will the way it used to, 30, 40 years ago.
Hello and welcome to another episode. Today we have with us Ammar Ali Jan. He is a Pakistani political activist, an academic and a historian. He is a founder and general secretary of Haqooq-e-Khalq Party and also a member of Progressive International. Moreover, he has also authored a book, Rule by Fear, 8 Theses on Authoritarianism in Pakistan. Assalamu alaikum.
Welcome.
Thank you so much for joining. My first question for this podcast today is that President Trump's recent visit to China has surprised many of us, especially given the years of tariffs and economic wars and technological rivalry and a strategic confrontation between the two powers. Do you see this shift as a genuine attempt at stabilization, or is it primarily driven by America's internal economic pressures and political calculations ahead of the next electoral election?
Trump has acted in his typical imperial arrogance for a very long time, but if you check his body language in China, he seemed very humbled in the presence of Xi Jinping.
Yeah.
And why is that the case? The US, despite its aggressive posture towards different countries, it is a declining imperial power. And I say it's a declining imperial power because its productive capacity has gone down drastically since the 1970s, when the production moved towards the east. And it still has a very strong military, and it tries to use its military capacity from time to time and again. But when it comes to its economic power, it tried to cripple Iran. What you saw in the war, Iran withstood the pressure. It's been trying to cripple Russia since 2022,
Yes.
and Russia has not bowed down in front of U.S. pressure. Its economy is also doing all right. It's tried crippling Venezuela,
Yeah.
Cuba, and it's only the recent pressure and escalation that has brought more worry to those two countries. But for a number of years, both those countries survived despite U.S. sanctions. And China has been under siege on and off for a very long time. And yet China has already emerged as the second largest economy. And I think Trump knows that his attempts to sanction the world, to increase tariffs, this attempt to bully countries in the global south, it may not work that well. Why? Because many countries now are seeing China as an alternative. If you remember, before Trump, Starmer went to China, the German Chancellor went to China, the Canadian Prime Minister went to China, Pakistan, which is a US ally, we're also very close to China. Iran is very close to China. And right after Trump, Putin went to China, right? So basically, China is emerging as a stabilizer in a very chaotic world.
Okay.
And it's also emerging as a country that's been helping different countries in the global south in terms of investment. If you look at almost any country in Latin America, its primary trading partner now is China. And the U.S. is very worried about it. U.S. wants to reverse this flow, but this is not a policy. This is the movement of history. See, this is where the world is going. This is where history is going. History is moving towards Beijing. And Trump will be, and it was clear that he will not be able to reverse the flow of history. That's why after all those bombastic, campaign speeches where he said China is our main enemy, he went to China despite the fact that there was nothing being offered by China as such on this trip. If you contrast this visit with Putin's visit, there were some very serious agreements between Russia and China that were signed, including on energy in the energy trade, which means that China also knows that it has the capacity to neutralize the threats by the US, directed at at itself, but also at other countries, including Russia and Iran and other countries. So I think a new world is now definitely emerging. The fact that Trump had to swallow his pride and go to Beijing, and right after that, Putin was given the red carpet treatment in the same city, it shows that America is unable to impose its will the way it used to, 30, 40 years ago. And that's great news for the world.
Okay, so the Taiwan issue increasingly appears to be the most dangerous flashpoint in global politics. From Beijing's perspective, reunification is presented as a question of sovereignty and historical destiny, while the United States frames its role as protecting regional stability and democracy. In your view, is the world moving towards an unavoidable confrontation over Taiwan, or do both powers still ultimately prefer strategic ambiguity over the open conflict?
Well, for now, I think there won't be any open conflict because the stakes are too high.
Okay.
As I said, the U.S. Economy cannot survive without China. So that's a huge thing. That's why Trump was there, right? And this issue has been there for a while, and one should also recognize the history of this issue. Taiwan was always part of China. In the entire modern period.
Yeah.
And the history of this modern Taiwan is basically a history internal to the civil war between the nationalists and the communists in China. The Kuomintang was the nationalist force that took over China in 1927, and the communists under the leadership of Mao Zedong were resisting them. The famous Long March was one of the high points of that resistance. There was an alliance between both the communists and the nationalists during the Japanese invasion in the 1930s. And by 1945-46, you had, again, open hostilities between the two sides. When Mao Zedong and the communists won in 1949, those who were defeated in the Kuomintang under the leadership of Chiang Kai-shek, they're the ones who fled to Taiwan. And so it's not a local issue. These were all Chinese who went there and created a one-party dictatorship under the U.S., with the full backing of the U.S., and killed thousands and thousands of Taiwanese leftists while turning Taiwan into a military base for U.S. imperialism. And, Mao Zedong compared Taiwan as a base in East Asia, compared it to Israel in the Middle East. He said, in Israel, in the Middle East, you have Israel acting as an American base, and in East Asia, you have Taiwan and eventually Japan as well. So this is the history of Taiwan. It's a fake country. It's basically a remnant of the civil war in China, and it was used or manipulated by imperialist forces to create maximal pressure on the Chinese government. However, what's interesting now is that the Kuomintang, its leadership, recently visited China, and they are discussing the possibility of reunification with China. The Kuomintang right now is in opposition, of course, in Taiwan, but they've, their leader was there in China recently. So there's this big debate in Taiwan as well about reunification, similar to what happened with Hong Kong. And I think we in Pakistan and in the global South in general, we should be very, very careful of any kind of propaganda on China coming out from Western sources, because they will not tell you this history. They will not tell you this history of Taiwan as internal to the civil war in China, or Tibet and the kind of feudalism that existed in Tibet, prior to the revolution, which eventually distributed the land amongst landless peasants, or Xinjiang, where the U.S. tried to start another jihad. They don't like jihad in Afghanistan, but they want another jihad in China. So they've used these flashpoints in order to undermine Chinese sovereignty. And they've been trying to do that since 1949. They've failed every time, and they will fail again in the future.
Okay. So China once positioned itself as an ideological alternative to Western capitalism, but today we see that it possesses global corporations, expanding financial influence, overseas strategic projects, and growing military ambitions as well. Has China effectively become a new version of the same capitalist imperialist system it once opposed, or does it still represent a fundamentally different model of global power? How do you justify this?
I think it's a fundamentally different power. Because if you look at the time period, you see, it is existing in a capitalist world. The world is a capitalist world, right? So when in 1989 the Berlin Wall fell, and then you had the fall of the Soviet Union in 91, one of the options for the Chinese leadership was to commit collective suicide and be like, okay, we're done with the system, right?
Okay.
Because now we don't want to engage with anyone outside the world, which means that we're going to have hunger and poverty for our own people. That's not socialism. The redistribution of poverty is not socialism. So okay, in this new situation where you've lost all your allies, you still want to continue on the path. What do? There are two very distinct paths that you can see between China and Russia. What Russia did after 91 and what China did after 91. Russia took the path of capitalism, as you point out, right? Capitalism in the most oligarchic sense. What did they do? They privatized all their public assets under the supervision of the IMF and the World Bank. They stripped workers of their rights, all the protections that they had. They allowed for monopolies in land and industry. They allowed global capital to come and invest in a very, like vultures in the economy. What it led to is what my friend Pavel calls a neoliberal holocaust. You had almost 20 million people who died because of the poverty that was imposed in this so-called restructuring. Naomi Klein has a wonderful book on it called The Shock Doctrine. The economy was shocked into privatization, and it led to the destruction of the economic base of the Soviet Union. And Russia became an extremely, extremely poor country with a very poor population under Boris Yeltsin. And this is also the time when the West loved Russia because they could invest anything they want. They could loot any of the resources. Russian women who had the most protections as compared to many other countries were forced into prostitution across the Gulf, across Europe. The same was the fate of a lot of people in Eastern Europe. So that's the kind of world they carved out for Russia. China took a very different path. And there's a very good book on this by Isabella Weber, where she calls it, I think the book is called How China Escaped Shock Therapy. And she shows this difference between the Russian path and the Chinese path. What the Chinese did is they said, okay, we need capital because, we need to feed our people. We need to give them jobs. We don't have that much development. But what we're going to do is we're going to create a system where the state will decide where the capital will come from and where it will flow. And this already started in the 1980s. So they had these 5-year plans, which included which industry do we need? What kind of education would we need for that industry? Where should that industry be posed? What will we gain out of that industry? How many engineers do we need? How many workers do we need? How will we use the wealth created from that industry to help the poor? How will we uplift them from poverty? And they controlled finance. See, they controlled they didn't let the financialization of the economy, unlike in the West where the banks control everything. Here, the Chinese state controls the banks. And then also with the corporations, it was necessary that every corporation will have members of the Communist Party on the board of governors. And 60% of the corporations are still held by the government, is in public ownership. So what was the result? The result was that whereas in Russia you had 20 million people dying of poverty because of capitalism, in China in the same period, they have managed to lift over 800 million people out of poverty.
Yeah.
So either those two capitalisms are so different that it'll be ridiculous to call both of them capitalism, or there's something significantly unique and specific about the Chinese model that did not create poverty but eradicated poverty. If you want to call it capitalism, I like it. If it can uplift so many people's lives, if it can create an industrial economy, if it can transform cities, if it can transform rural landscape, that is our goal here in Pakistan as well. And they've done it despite the hostility of the West. Whereas Russia was getting aid from all these international agencies, IMF and World Bank, China was still barred, but they were fighting back, and they built this new beautiful world. So I think it'll be very unfair to reduce the Chinese experience to the Russian experience or to the Pakistani experience or to any other experience. This is a distinct path. I like to call it an economy in transition. It's a transitional economy towards socialism, and that means there will be contradictions, but there's no economic policy that will not have contradictions in the real world.
Okay. So many analysts also argue that the decline of the unipolar American dominance has not necessarily produced a just world, but rather a more fragmented and unstable one. So as emerging powers like China, Russia, and regional blocs gain influence, are we witnessing the birth of a genuinely multipolar order, or simply the transition from one hegemonic system to competing empires? Because I was talking to Dr. Kamran Bokhari, and he said there is no such thing as a multipolar world order. That's just stupidity. So what's your take on this?
I stand with stupidity here.
Okay.
I think there is a multipolar world emerging. That's why, as I said initially, they could not destroy Russia. Putin, with all his flaws, he took a stand on the question of Ukraine when they were trying to induct Ukraine into NATO. And the fact that Russia was not destroyed shows that there are other ways of surviving even under assault from the US. The same is true, with Iran. They've managed to fight back because they had backing from other countries. Similarly, in Latin America, despite all the problems, you have a robust, regional system that is being built. Mexico is leading it. You should read about Dr. Claudia Sheinbaum. Like, she's a fantastic. She's probably the smartest president we have in the world today.
Okay.
And she has been taking a position against U.S. empire. So you have all these new nodal points that are emerging. A country like Pakistan can maintain good relations with both the U.S. and China, despite the fact that their relations, they're very tense right now. And we can also maintain good relations with Iran and the U.S. and the Saudis and Iran, right? This would not have been possible 10 years ago.
True.
Right? America would have either sanctioned us, or Iran would have been too suspicious of us. The Saudis would have sanctioned us. But why are they tolerating this? Or why are they even encouraging this? Because everybody understands that there are multiple pillars of power now. And most of human history has been like that. This experience of a few cities in the world, Brussels, London, Paris, and eventually Washington became even a bigger monopoly than them after 1945. Them controlling the entire globe is a very modern phenomenon. There's always been regional empires. The Chinese have always been in their region. Then you've had other regional empires. Now, of course, we're not looking at an imperial world. We're looking at regional relations between different states. Now, that does not mean that there will be no asymmetry of power, that every country will be equal immediately. Of course not. That's a utopian idea. It opens the possibility for fighting for equality in a way that the US-led world did not open. Because in a US-led world, if people say, there's this joke, why did socialism fail in that country? Because the CIA overthrew the government, right? So that's been the problem that's the simple answer for almost 99% of the cases, right? But when the US cannot overthrow governments, when you have alternative poles to go to, then history opens up. Then you have possibilities. Then you have opportunities. We can still mess up those opportunities, and Pakistan is excellent at messing up opportunities, but at least we will have opportunities.
Okay.
And that is not a small thing for a country like, so many countries who could never develop because sanctions could just end your economy immediately. The fact that today they can survive those sanctions, this is world historical. People don't realize it's the first time that this even possibility has arisen with the rise of China, that a non-European country has become so economically powerful. It's the first time since the 18th century that we have something like this, and we should be very excited about it.
Okay. So my last question is that historically the United States justified its global interventions through the language of democracy, human rights, and the rules-based order. China, meanwhile, presents itself as a partner focused on trade and development rather than ideological interference. Do you think countries in Global South genuinely view China as a less coercive alternative to American power, or is Beijing simply using softer rhetoric while pursuing similar geopolitical ambitions?
China wants to have trade and good economic relations with any country, right? And
Nothing more than that.
well, they would want to make as much money as possible as well, right? I mean, that's what countries want, right? That in itself is not evil. You just negotiate, you fight back, But the comparison with the US, I find to be very, very bizarre, that a lot of people make. What would it mean for comparing the US with China? The US sanctioned more than 100 countries. Sanctioned them. Bombed the hell out of Korea. 30 to 40 lakh, 3 to 4 million people killed. Same in Vietnam. Same in Cambodia, same in Laos. Every Latin American country, Argentina, Brazil, Venezuela, Cuba, everywhere they had US-backed military dictatorships. We had US-backed military dictatorships in Pakistan. We had a brutal counter-revolution in Afghanistan, that the US funded. We've seen the destruction of a number of Arab countries backed by Israel and the US. We're seeing a genocide in Raza as we speak. We are seeing 700 to 800 US military bases across the world. Right? We're seeing the IMF and the World Bank not just giving loans, but actually working with governments to make their budgets, to make their economic policies, totally taking away their economic sovereignty, which is what's happening to us here as well in Pakistan, right? Our budgets are made by low-level IMF technocrats.
Yeah.
In all of that, if any country wants to fight back, then the government, there's sanctions, regime change, bombardment. And if you compare that to China, which has a record of regime change operations in 0 countries, or sanctions in 0 countries, since 1980, wars in 0 countries, I think it's a very, very unfair comparison.
Okay.
You can criticize Chinese policy here, criticize Chinese policy there. That's fine. Everybody makes mistakes. But imperialism carries a historical weight.
Okay.
China has 1 military base outside China, right?
Yes.
Even that under the UN. They have 800. China has no IMF World Bank. China is Pakistan's largest creditor. But China is not making our budget. It's not saying bring socialism. It's not saying bring neoliberalism. It is giving loans. The loans can be predatory, and I have my own critique of the nature of the loans, and they can be they should be renegotiated. But it's not comparable to what the US has done. All finance ministers are approved by the US. They're appointed by the US. All of them in the last 30 years. So I think that gap, that difference between the US and imperialist power that carries the legacy of colonial times versus this country of the global south that's rising, which of course has asymmetrical power relations with other countries, has its own ambitions. but the gap is just too wide in how both of them function to even make that comparison at this moment.
Okay. So thank you so much. You have given a great perspective to our audience. Thank you so much for your presence today in the show.
My pleasure. Thank you. Thank you.
Welcome.